But this is different. This is about the editorial board saying that, being told to say that if it's possible that it could do any harm at all to a group of people, to a whole group of people, not to the research participants, but to a whole group of people that are being studied as part of that thing, then you can't let it be published, or you can retract it post-publication. And it is so vague that you could easily allow somebody's own biases as an editor to mess with the whole dang thing. Alrighty. A few of you who follow things going on the science end of Twitter may have noticed a few folks talking about this particular article. Um, and there's been a lot going on about this particular article, so I'm going to go a little bit longer, probably, than I normally would. Science must respect the dignity and rights of all humans. New ethics guidance address the potential harms for human population groups who do not participate in research but may be harmed by its publication. So, this is an editorial in the journal Nature Human Behavior, which Nature is a very broad, over-encompassing group of journals, and they have different topics. Like, you'll see nature physics, nature chemistry, nature climate change, nature human behavior, and then just straight up at the top, nature, which is kind of the all-encompassing and very general one. Each of the nature somethings are very specific to a discipline or to a field, and what have you, though they are, well, were prestigious. But I want to make a point on this and give you a little bit of back history, because I'm not seeing that done anywhere. And I think that's somewhat relevant to understand what this is that makes it so perniciously bad. I am not the only one who read this. As you'll find out, there's an article in Quillette. Well, I'll show you some of it. And there have been others who've been chiming in on social media and the like, who have, I think, in an interesting way, it has prompted a lot of discussion, because there are some ethical questions that I can understand why they were asked. At the same time, the way these authors, this editorial board, is suggesting to go about some of those ethical questions is a really bad idea. So back up for a bit first. So there's something called the Belmont Report, and as you can see here, it was written by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. It was created as a result of the National Research Act of 1974, and was charged with identifying basic ethical principles that should underlie the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects, and developing guidelines to assure that such research is conducted in accordance with those principles. Informed by monthly discussions that spanned nearly 4 years and an intensive 4 days of deliberation in 1976, the Commission published the Belmont Report, which identifies basic ethical principles and guidelines that address ethical issues arising from conduct research with the human subjects. So, the backstory and the long history, and this is where I can say, in history, there have been unmitigated evil things that have happened and been determined so by science. Not determined so by science, but I mean, that was the wrong way to say it. Not determined so by science, but were claimed as being done for scientific research or what have you. And in reality, it was some very evil people who are bastardizing things. And a good example of that in the longer things. So if you click on reading the Belmont Report, you can go in on the HHS website and look at this. And the reason the Belmont Report, I bring it up, is for currently any institution that is doing human subjects research, whether it be medicine or social sciences or psychology or any number of different things, has to abide by the ethical principles in the Belmont Report. It is off of the Belmont Report that any institutional review board makes their judgments on whether or not a research is ethical, whether or not it is protective of the subjects of the research. And the reason I bring this up is it's really important. It does have important back to it. Ethical principles and guidelines for research involving human subjects. Scientific research has produced substantial social benefits. It has also posed some troubling ethical questions. Public attention was drawn to these questions by reported abuses of human subjects in biomedical experiments, especially during the Second World War. Most people don't realize is that the Nazis did some really, really horrible things to anybody they had in those concentration camps and biomedical experiments. It was horrifically bad. During the Nuremberg war crime trials, the Nuremberg Code was drafted as a set of standards for judging physicians and scientists who had conducted biomedical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. This code became the prototype of many later codes intended to assure that research involving human subjects would be carried out in an ethical manner. The codes consist of rules, some general, others specific, that guide the investigators or the researchers of research in their work. Such rules are often inadequate to cover complex situations, at times that came into conflict, and they are frequently difficult to interpret or apply. Broader ethical principles will provide a basis on which specific rules may be formulated, criticized, and interpreted. 3 principles or general prescriptive judgments that are relevant to research involving human subjects are identified in this statement. Other principles may also be relevant. These 3 are comprehensive, however, and are stated at a level of generalization that should assist scientists, subjects, reviewers, and interested citizens to understand the ethical issues inherent in research involving human subjects. These principles cannot always be applied so as to resolve beyond dispute particular ethical problems. The objective is to provide an analytical framework that will guide the resolution of ethical problems arising from research involving human subjects. This statement consists of a distinction between research and practice, a discussion of 3 basic ethical principles, and remarks about the applications of these principles. So I read that because that's backstory. The reason these ethical codes, the Belmont Report and other things came around was because of the recognition that without some kind of ethical guidance, you can have some really shitty things happen to your human subjects of the research. To your human, which is to say, these are the participants in your research experiment, the human subjects who are participating. Not somebody who's not participating. Therein lies the distinction. And therein lies the problem. So, to mention it, the basic ethical principles outlined in the Belmont Report, there's 3 of them. And it really does boil down to a lot of things that are important. Respect for persons is the first one. It incorporates at least 2 ethical convictions. First, that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and second, that persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. This principle for respect for persons thus divides into 2 separate moral requirements: the requirement to acknowledge autonomy and the requirement to protect those with diminished autonomy. Here's the thing. So, respect for persons. First off, they got to figure out whether or not you have diminished authority. Diminished authority usually means if the person's a child, if the person has some kind of mental disorder and cannot for whatever reason answer the question for themselves. If they're in a prison, that actually counts as somebody with diminished autonomy, because they're obviously not entirely in control of everything that goes on around them, because you're in a prison. And respecting what respect for persons has to do with is the idea that you cannot force someone into doing an experiment, being part of your research experiment. You cannot force someone to do it. You also cannot trick someone into doing it. You cannot guilt somebody into doing it. All of those kinds of things that you might think of as coercive as getting somebody to do it, you cannot do it. That's the idea of respect for persons. And if there's diminished autonomy, then it has to be, and like in the case of children, it has to be the parents who respond. Beneficence is the idea, and this is, I think, where a lot of the Nature article seems to come into play with an extension that is going to drive people crazy. Persons are treated in an ethical manner not only by respecting their decisions and protecting them from harm, but also making efforts to secure their well-being. Such treatment falls under the principle of beneficence. The term beneficence is often understood to cover acts of kindness or charity that go beyond strict obligation. In this document, beneficence is understood in a stronger sense, as an obligation. Two general rules have been formulated as complementary expressions of beneficent actions in this sense. One, do not harm, and two, maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms. So basically, that's to say, you're identifying really carefully, if you have any participants in your experiment, if any harm could possibly come to them. And you literally have to think of every little thing that you can think of, in particular if you're doing a medical research study. You got to think of all the possible side effects, all this other stuff, and it has to be communicated to your participants. In part of the respect for persons thing is informed consent, where they have to know what's the possible harms that could happen to me for being part of this. What are the possible benefits? Is my data going to be secure? Privacy is more and more coming into these kinds of things. And if the do no harm thing comes in there, that's the Hippocratic Oath. And the final one is actually justice. Who ought to receive the benefits of research and bear its burdens? This is a question of justice in a sense of fairness in distribution, or what is deserved. An injustice occurs when some benefit to which a person is entitled is denied without good reason, or when some burden is imposed unduly. Another way of conceiving the principle of justice is that equals ought to be treated equally. However, the statement requires explication. Who is equal and who is unequal? What considerations justify departure from equal distribution? Almost all commentators allow that distinctions based on experience, age, deprivation, competence, merit, and position do sometimes constitute criteria justifying differential treatment for certain purposes. It is necessary then to explain what respects people should be treated equally. There's several widely accepted formulations of just ways to distribute burdens and benefits. Each formulation mentions some relevant property on the basis of which burdens and benefits should be distributed. These formulations are: 1, to each person an equal share; 2, to each person according to individual need; 3, each person according to individual effort; 4, each person according to societal contribution; and 5, to each person according to merit. So those are your kind of three main principles here. And it's just basically to say that you're not putting an excess burden on somebody. You're making it as easy as possible to participate in an experiment, is the idea there. So, but all of those things that I just read with the Belmont report correspond to the idea that these are the research participants themselves and the ethical considerations given to those participants. That is not what the Nature editorial is about. I want to make that abundantly clear, because this Nature editorial is about something very different, and it's actually very much stated in the first couple of paragraphs. Although academic freedom is fundamental, it is not unbounded. The same ethical considerations should underlie science about humans as applied to research with human participants. Well-established ethics frameworks govern the conduct of studies with human participants. Research ethics bodies use these frameworks to examine prospectively whether research projects involving human participants align with ethical principles. That's what I just read, the Belmont report, or the parts of it that I just read of the Belmont report, but you get the idea. However, these frameworks apply to research involving the participation of humans and do not generally consider the potential benefits and harms of research about humans who do not participate directly in the research. Such research is typically exempt from ethics review. Do you get what I'm saying? Because everything I just said about the Belmont report applies to the individuals who are participating in the research study in question. And this is where this goes off the rails, because it's trying to say here, what the authors ultimately try to say with this is, is that we can't publish this thing necessarily, or allow this thing to be published if it might be harmful to an entire group of people, or perpetuate stereotypes or some other strange nonsense. Never mind the fact that they actually don't give any examples by what they mean. But let us go for that, and let us go again. Yet, people can be harmed indirectly. For example, research may inadvertently stigmatize individuals or human groups. It may be discriminatory, racist, sexist, ableist, or homophobic. It may provide justification for undermining the human rights of specific groups simply because of their social characteristics. Oh boy. Along with other Springer Nature colleagues, We led the development of new guidance that addresses these potential harms and is incorporated in our research ethics guidance. This guidance extends beyond the consideration of the principles, beneficence, and non maleficence, key elements of all ethics frameworks for research with human participants, to any academic publication. There you have it. In this guidance, we urge authors to be respectful of the dignity and rights of the human groups they study. We encourage researchers to consider the potential implications of research on human groups defined on the basis of social characteristics to be reflective of their authorial perspective. If not, I'm pretty sure that's a new way to say lived experience. But anyway, if not part of the group they understudy, and to contextualize their findings to minimize as much as possible potential misuse or risks of harm to the studied groups in the public sphere. We also highlight the importance of respectful, non-stigmatizing language to avoid perpetuating stereotypes and causing harm to individuals and groups. So, yeah. There's a lot of crazy, interesting things in here. But what is concerning to me is, let's see. Authors should ensure writing is free from stereotypes or cultural assumptions. We recommend avoiding the use of descriptors that refer to attributes such as race, ethnicity, national or social origin, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, political or other beliefs. We advise authors writing in English follow the guidance on bias-free, I'm going to have to look that up, bias-free language provided by the American Psychological Association when preparing their manuscript, regardless of content type, research, review, or opinion, and for research regardless of whether a research project was reviewed and approved by an appropriate institutional ethics committee. Editors reserve the right to request modifications to, or correct or otherwise amend post-publication, and in severe cases refuse publication of or retract post-publication. So they got 4 things in here. So content that is premised upon the assumption of inherent biological, cultural, social or cultural superiority or inferiority of one human group over another, and based on, I'm not going to read all of these because it's a mouthful, but content that undermines or could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual or human group on the basis of socially constructed or socially relevant human groupings. Content that includes images or text that directly or indirectly disparage a person or group on the basis of socially constructed groupings. Submissions that embody singular privileged perspectives which are exclusionary of a diversity of voices in relation to socially constructed groupings and what have you. And they provide a whole bunch of things down here. They go into greater depth on some of the other things with racism and sexism and what have you. But I'm trying to keep it brief, and I encourage you to go read this and get your own thoughts together yourself, particularly if this is something with human ethics and you do human subjects research on a regular basis. I suggest going and looking at this. But at least from what I could find reading it, the problem with a lot of these things and what they were saying is that they're so vague. They're so vague, and I think in here one of the reasons they go off in such a vague thing is, like this particular thing, saying that definitions will require frequent revisiting. That is why they are so vague. That is why they are so bloody vague with this, because they can give no definitions for anything, because it's all going to be changing, right? And that makes it incredibly vague, and that makes it incredibly easy for an editor to just remove something because somebody is offended by it, which frankly undermines doing scientific research to begin with. I don't get me wrong, there is a very fine balance there between doing scientific research with human subjects, getting answers to the research questions that you're after getting an answer to, and being fair and ethical to those people who are participating. So this is from Quillette. Bo Weingart wrote for Quillette in this one, and he had a few choice words that I wanted to add to this. Uh, an editorial in Nature, human behavior provides the most recent indication of just how bad things are becoming. I agree that nature is a mess. It begins, like in so many other essays of its kind, by announcing that although academic freedom is fundamental, it is not unbounded. When the invocation of fundamental freedom in one clause is immediately undermined in the next, we should be skeptical of whatever follows. Indeed. Indeed. That's why I kind of grimaced when I read it. It's fundamental, but in this case, the authors are taking issue with with a view very few people actually hold. At minimum, most academics will readily. Okay, I will actually ask Bo the question if he can substantiate that claim, because at this point I don't know it and I'd prefer to see it. So that's just a question on my part. At minimum, most academics will readily accept that scientific curiosity should be constrained by ethical concerns about research participants. Absolutely. Okay. Unfortunately, the authors then announced that they also wish to apply these well established frameworks to humans who do not participate directly in the research. They are especially concerned that people can be harmed indirectly by research that inadvertently stigmatizes human individuals or human groups. Okay. In plain language, this means that from now on, the journal will reject articles that might potentially harm, even inadvertently, those groups or individuals or groups most vulnerable to racism, sexism, ableism, or homophobia. Since it is already standard practice to reject false or poorly argued work, it is safe to assume that these new guidelines have been designed to reject any article deemed to pose a threat to disadvantaged groups, irrespective of whether or not its central claims are true or at least well supported. Within a few sentences, we have moved from a banal statement of the obvious to draconian and censorious editorial discretion. Editors will now enjoy unprecedented power to reject articles on the basis of nebulous moral concerns and anticipated harms. So, admittedly, and the one thing with one of the things with beneficence in the Belmont report is you are supposed to think of what are the anticipated harms because you got to inform your participants about it. But that's your participants, not the broader public as a whole, not the broader group of people. Oh goodness. Let's see. Imagine for a moment. Yeah, that's the note about Catholics. Again, I'm not going to read through all of this right now. I'm trying to keep this as short as I can for you guys. But I want to make a point. I want to bring up this here. So yeah, I read this part earlier. The new guidelines state even if a project reviewed and approved, appropriate committees, editors reserve the right if it contains content that, and he's restating what I said earlier. No examples are adduced, of course, so it is difficult to know what kind of content would commit these retractable iniquities rather. Could a discussion of group differences in cognitive ability reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual or human group? Would an exploration of sex differences in homicide rates, would an analysis of political differences in cognitive rigidity, would a test of association between religiosity and prosociality? And who is to be the judge of what is and is not reasonable, and what does or does not constitute undermining? Ambiguity is piled on top of ambiguity to expand the capricious purview of the censor. It does not require clairvoyance to predict that these criteria will not be consistently applied. It may be considered racist to point out the disproportionate number of crimes are committed by Black Americans, but it will surely not be considered misandrist to point out that a disproportionate number of crimes are committed by American males. Quoting here from Quillette, by the way. Even those who work ardently for the triumph of progressive ideas and values should shudder. Not only will these guidelines further degrade the embattled prestige of science, but they offer remarkable deference to the idiosyncratic moral concerns of editors and reviewers, which are subject to change at short notice. As radical feminists have recently discovered, those who sit within the progressive Overton window today may find themselves thrust outside of it tomorrow, victims of a censorious system they thought they were erecting in their own interests. And it goes on from here. So Bo does a great job of breaking the whole thing down. So I encourage you to go read it, along with the actual original article. But oh boy. Yeah, there was one thing up here that he said that I actually want to finish on if I can find it real quick. Yeah. And he makes a good point, and it's something I've indirectly harped upon a few times myself. Although the modern prestige bestowed upon science is laudable, it is not without peril. For as the ideological value of science increases, so too does the threat to its objectivity. Slogans and hashtags can quickly politicize science, and scientists can be tempted to subordinate the pursuit of the truth to moral or political ends as they become aware of their own prodigious social importance. Inconvenient data can be suppressed or hidden and inconvenient research can be quashed. This is especially true when one political tribe or faction enjoys disproportionate influence in academia. Its members can disfigure science, often unconsciously, in support of their own ideological preferences. This is how science becomes more like propaganda than empiricism, and academia becomes more like a partisan media organization than an impartial institution. That is exactly it. That is exactly it. Because unfortunately, what Bo's getting at here is the more it's realized that you can use scientific research for ideological ends, or the scientific process to achieve your ideological ends, the more your objectivity goes out the window with these kinds of things. And that is the concern. And frankly, I'm surprised that we haven't learned that lesson from history. I'm really surprised that that lesson hasn't been learned from history. Because, you know, that kind of ideological fanaticism has certainly caused a lot of different things to go completely wrong in scientific history in the past. Lysenko being the biggest one that comes immediately to mind. And Bo talks about Lysenko at the end. But yeah, I don't look at this nature editorial as a good thing. I don't look at this thing about benefit and harm and applying it to the rest of the world, and because some people might be offended, as being a good thing. And it's so ambiguous that it is very, very easy to it would be very, very easy to manipulate and very, very easy to apply their own partisan beliefs to it. And one of the reasons I mention that is because it will go haywire. Because of that, it will go haywire in a long way. Now, let me just make a point here, because I know what I read from the Belmont report could also be ambiguous. This is not entirely true, because there is actually very well established framework for the institutional review boards, and how are the participants kept safe. And there's some very strict oversight in most cases with institutional review boards of any human subjects research. And which is why I'm going to say, if you have somebody that's doing research on human subjects, on kids, on adults, anything like that, there's an institutional review board that has to be overseeing it. At this point, there's a huge number of laws and regulations that oversee that. But this is different. This is about the editorial board saying that, being told to say that if it's possible that it could do any harm at all to a group of people, to a whole group of people, not to the research participants, but to a whole group of people that are being studied as part of that thing, then you can't let it be published, or you can retract it post-publication. And it is so vague that you could easily allow somebody's own biases as an editor to mess with the whole dang thing. And because they've also put in the whole thing of the vague definitions, could be anything that gets the article thrown out in the editor's eyes. There's no specificity there that can restrict somebody from exercising their power too much. And that's not good. Not good at all for scientific research. So there's certainly a balancing act there when it comes to ethical research practices in human studies with human subjects. But yeah, somehow I don't think just randomly throwing things out because of other groups that may be offended is such a good thing. Yeah, humans who do not participate directly in the research. That's just going to cause a mess. That's all that really is going to do. That's just going to cause a mess. Alrighty, that's it, folks. Let me know what you think. If you like this video, hit the like button on the way out the door. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.